Right, here we
Yeah.
are for the first of our regularly scheduled video recordings.
Yeah, whatever we're calling this thing.
Exactly, I don't think we've got a name for it. So
They-
I would say it's fortnightly, but you'd say bi-weekly. So
Mhm. Yeah, we're going to try to make good on that one.
yeah, exactly. That's
Mhm.
right. That's right. Yes, yes. I remember when I went to Canada actually, and I used the word fortnightly, and I moved over there. I was living there and used the word fortnightly, and everyone I was actually quite amused by that. They understood what I meant, but I asked them. They said they wouldn't use the word themselves. So,
Yeah, I mean, I've heard, I'll do it in a fortnight or something like that, but I haven't really processed what the term was. So
yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Mostly Brits and Aussies and Kiwis. I think they use that.
sounds good.
In any
All right.
case, why don't we introduce ourselves? Vern, do
Yeah.
you want to go first?
Well, let's see. Off the top of my head, I am just some guy who moved from Minnesota to Florida to escape the craziness, the riots, uh, and well, it's been great here. Otherwise, I've been involved with since the tail end of last year, I've been a part of A Voice for Men, and early this year, I've become one of the senior editors, actually. So I've been pretty busy with that one. Last year, of course, I was one of the co-hosts with Chris Vody of the American wing of the International Conference for Men's Issues. And aside from that, I'm just trying to just setting an example and doing my own thing. And yeah, that's just my approach to everything. A lot of my focus as of late has been more on the MGM side of things. Speaking as an intact American myself, but I guess nowadays, I'm kind of gearing more attention towards the whole Roe versus Wade kind of a sort of deal. Now that's kind of more hot topic. I've been kind of quiet on that before, but I guess I'm kind of made to force my hand on this one. So
Sort of reached that point, really, hasn't it, in the US now?
Yeah. What about you, Robert? How do we know you?
Right. So So I've been involved in men's rights for about 8 or 9 years now. I saw the problems for a long time. Even when I was quite young, sort of look to the 90s, I saw a lot of the problems, but what I failed to realize how severe many of them were. And it took me a long time to sort of come to terms with how severe they were. And I've often said I was 80% red pill by the time I was 20, but it took another 20 years to get the rest of the way. But when I realized that how serious things were, I realized I felt I really had to step up. So been involved with A Voice for Men for a number of years. I was an editor for many years, and in January, Paul Whelan approached me and asked me if I'd be interested in taking over the site, which I was. So he transferred the site to me in January, and yes, we've been running it along with some other people ever since. And actually, you've been involved for a couple of years now, would be a couple of years.
With the site or just
with A Voice for Men.
No, just last year.
Oh, it was last year, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah. It's all been kind of sudden for me. So.
Yeah. Anyway, so I was also involved with the International Conference for Men's Issues on the Australian leg, and it was fantastic. That was ICMI 21. Absolutely fantastic experience. Yes, and I was also involved in ICMI 20, which was also an online conference. So that was originally going to be in Sydney. I was going to be running that, but unfortunately, with the pandemic, it all had to get cancelled, and so we moved it online. And I also did ICMI 17, which was in Australia.
Right. I was part of the year 21 also, but not in a really official capacity. I just contributed something to that one. So
that's right. Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned before being an intact American. That puts you in a relatively small proportion of the population, actually.
I think so, and there were multiple factors, right? Like it had to do with me being a U.S. citizen born abroad in Japan, but it was said that my dad didn't believe in it, so those were at least two two factors that allowed me to be spared.
Right.
Yeah.
So your dad's American.
Yes.
Right. So that would put him in a fairly small proportion of the population too, actually being someone who doesn't believe in it. I think it's pretty prevalent in the US.
I believe so. I'm trying to figure out what the demographics of them are. Is it more like a northern or southern thing, or does it really matter? That kind of thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's worse. That's something I'm interested in kind of studying more.
That's interesting, actually. The data should be available. So I've actually looked at the data for Australia, and notably, Australia is quite a homogenous society relative to the US. We
Sure.
have 6 states, number of territories, but people move around a lot more. So there's a tendency for there to be less cultural distinction. And despite that, there's actually a fairly considerable variation in the proportion of boys who are circumcised in Australia. And it sort of goes, I think, between somewhere. The national average is about 10% now. But the state average varies quite considerably. I think one state was as high as 18%. It was quite a long while ago. I looked at it, but even here in Australia, it varies quite a bit, which I found to be quite interesting. So I wouldn't be at all surprised, actually, if there was considerable variation in the US.
Now, we talk a lot about how United States is kind of big on this whole thing, but we rarely talk about other countries here. So I guess, this still sounds like, one too many for me, in Australia, of course.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah. So what is it, more religion based, or is it more just available services? Because I know that it's more close to like how is the healthcare system in Australia anyway? Is it more like a national health system, or?
Right. So
Okay.
we have, our system could actually be described as a hybrid system. So as I mentioned before, I've lived in Canada, so I've been able to compare to Canada. In Canada, you basically can't, except for a few selected services that were kind of grandfathered in, you can't pay for healthcare. So there's a provincial-based system, and that's what you go through, and you basically that's your only option. In Australia, in contrast, there's a national health system, so the government pays for primary healthcare in most cases. However, you're allowed to pay for healthcare if you want to. So if I needed an operation and I didn't want to wait through the public system, I could just go to a doctor and drop money on the table and have that, and have the operation, or if I needed one. So I often describe our system as hybrid. It's kind of interesting. I think the Australian Medical Association has, some years ago, not that long ago, I think only a few years ago, dropped support for circumcision, and the rate was already quite low.
Okay.
So I think the national rate is about 10%, but it's dropped considerably in the last 2 generations. And I actually think it actually has something to do with an American influence. So now I don't know what the rate was before World War II, but we had a lot of American soldiers here during World War II, and it did have quite an influence on the culture in many ways. And my suspicion, I haven't confirmed this, but my suspicion is that circumcision rates actually spiked after World War II
Because of the American exposure.
Because of the American exposure, exactly, and then have been declining ever since. So that's kind of my feeling. There is a sort of a latent. Of course, we talk about intactivism, which is the movement to abolish MGM alongside FGM, and almost all MRAs are also intactivists. I would say that Australian culture has a bit of a latent thread of intactivism. Actually, there's quite a fairly high proportion of the population that are quite passionate about it. Actually, we haven't. It is unfortunately still legal here, and when there isn't enough political will yet to make it illegal, but there are a lot of people who find it highly objectionable, and certainly I think if people here were talking about circumcising boys, and I've seen this myself actually, there'll often be somebody who'll speak up and say, no, actually, I think you should not do that, and here's why. So, which is something that's missing, I think, in the US. At least that's my sense.
Sure. Well, to go back to that American influence, so a lot of the times I hear story because I follow Brother K and the Bloodstained Man and everything like that. And there's like a lot of anecdotes from European women saying that they've never seen a circumcised one. And, those who have experienced it says it feels horrible. So why were the Australians talked into it at that time?
Yeah, so at the time, I suspect that there was so in Australia at the time, Australia was feeling very threatened. I mean, there was war with Japan. Australia was, in a sense, on the front line. Many Australians of my grandparents' generation will quite openly say the Americans saved us. America puts something like 1 million troops or something in Australia. Now, what would happen was American and Australian troops would be fighting in the islands north of Australia and in the Pacific. The Americans basically treated Australia like the R&R location. So as they cycled their troops out of combat, they would bring them back to Australia. It was a relatively similar society. It was stable and so forth. So it was a good place for them to have some rest. And had Australia been directly attacked, there would have been a lot of troops, American troops here to help defend the country. So I think it was a win-win. So as a result, though, I think a lot of Australians of my grandfather's generation would absolutely say, the Americans saved Australia in terms of the military force that they put here to defend the country. And so there was a lot of positive feeling towards Americans in that generation.
Yeah, of course.
They were very thankful for the help that the US provided Australia in the war. And of course, it was reciprocal. The benefit of the US's military aims as well, but it's absolutely made Australia a much more difficult target. Okay. So I think there was a lot of positive, that sort of positive aspect, and that reflected in the culture. And that's my suspicion. I actually haven't been able to confirm the rate before, but my suspicion is it did spike.
Absolutely. So I guess it's just the American influence for the sake of being the American influence that probably added to it. Because one hypothesis I have is that, in general, America being the big exception here, I guess cultures in general, like, don't think about it, but are too open to the idea because, if somebody tries to convince them, well, this is what you should do, they might end up doing it, sadly. There's no hard, backlash that we're seeing after the damage is done. So in a way, I think other countries are more vulnerable to this idea. And look what's happening in Africa and some Southeast Asian countries, I believe. And recently I've seen South Korea having a bit of a high rate, I think, if I got my source right.
And there's that American influence potentially again,
yeah.
Actually. The American troops stationed there for 70 years now or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
right.
It's a good point you bring up in Africa. You mentioned Brother K before too. As for those who don't know, Brother K is an American gentleman now in his 70s. He and his wife have been campaigning against male genital mutilation for decades. Very, very prominent figure in the movement. And of course, he actually started the Blood-Stained Men.
Right. There's a lot of insightful material, like, they expose like like what we consider horrendous social media posts that basically belittle and mock their own children, the before and after phenomenon. That's I've told people this, and I told Europeans this, and they're absolutely shocked that this sort of thing would happen. But it's like an everyday thing. I've had people who I used to know that did this back in the past. So that was rather distasteful even then. And what else? And the consequences, the deaths that can potentially occur, and they do occur. All that information is on their Facebook page and everything. So
that's right, and the damage that's done. But I have to say though, even if there was no damage or anything like that, which we know there is, but even if there was no damage and there were no deaths, for me it's still a bodily autonomy issue, and it's not okay on that basis. If an individual chooses to be circumcised, a man chooses to be circumcised, he can do that as an adult. He can make that decision himself. But babies, the choice is being taken away from these individuals simply because they're babies and they can't object and they can't stop it being done to them.
Exactly. And I have to kind of go on a bit of a tangent here because we're speaking about body autonomy now. Now, we of course got this whole uproar about Roe versus Wade, and everybody's screeching about body autonomy but I consider it to be a hypocrisy on what I see is both sides of the American pro-choice and pro-life sides when it comes to this. So the pro-choice sides will say, my body, my choice, whatever, but of course they're probably likely to be circumcisers, and those who arrange to have their own children do that. But of course on the pro-life side, they'll go about the sanctity of the unborn, which I'm more anti-abortion nowadays, but still I have to point out this hypocrisy. They're willing to put their sons on the chopping block and literally risk death, and they often admit it sometimes.
And they'll often argue it's a parent's choice, but of course parents have the right to make decisions relating to the medical care of their children because the children cannot yet consent or in many cases understand the
Right.
choice that needs to be made. But that's a medical matter, and
Yeah.
even informed proponents of MGM will admit that circumcision isn't actually a medical requirement. So
Exactly.
therefore, that shouldn't apply.
Yeah, and now too many are duped and think it's like the healthier, cleaner thing to do, but that's what they are. They've been duped.
Yes, exactly. But there's no specific medical requirement. Even I've even talked to informed individuals who are advocates of MGM, and even they have admitted to me that it isn't a specific medical requirement. You're right that they do. They say, oh, it's cleaner, reduces HIV. There's various
Right.
claims that are made. UTIs, reduction in urinary tract infections is one example that's often given. But of course, as I often like to say, so UTIs are actually more common in females than males, regardless of whether the male's been circumcised or not. And
Right.
I would say in the case of females, UTIs are treated with antibiotics, but apparently in the case of males, they're treated with preventative surgery for some reason.
I see. Yeah. And by the way, speaking as the intact American guy here, no STIs, no diseases, and I'm not what you would call an abstinent kind of guy. So.
So it's interesting, actually. I've heard in Africa. So it's interesting to even have a look at the places in the world where circumcision predominantly occurs too. So the Middle East, large parts of Africa, and essentially the United States. But as you said, is growing in places like Asia.
Yeah.
But one problem, you mentioned Africa earlier, one problem I've heard, and it's really quite concerning, there's been a lot of Western organizations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is one, where they've been pushing circumcision in Africa, they've been advertising and so forth. But one thing that I've heard it may be occurring, and this is something that we suspected might occur, is that people are starting to view it as, because they pushed on the basis of an anti-AIDS line, people may be using it as an alternative to condom use.
So what I've heard this has referred to, I think it was either Hannah Wallen or Karen Strawn on the Underage Radio when they were talking about this. I think they referred to this as a surgical vaccine. I think it is.
All right.
That might have been the term they used. I probably don't have it all right, but it was something to that effect. And basically, they would get it and actually proceed to have more debauched, more unrestrained sex, and then proceed to get more infections.
And certainly now it's more unprotected sex. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And so there is some evidence that this is occurring, and the AIDS rate may be increasing in some of these countries now in Africa compared to what we were seeing before, where use of condoms was actually quite successful.
Right.
So this is really concerning, actually, and really, I mean, if I think the obvious solution to the risks of AIDS is things like condoms and so forth, rather than trying to, for some reason, they were trying to argue they should circumcise and use a condom, but if using a condom, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, condoms kind of, it's that much of an obstacle in terms of the function and the sensation anyway, if we can go into this kind of territory in this podcast.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, right. But
yeah.
Oh, it is. Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, go on. Yeah.
But the thing is, the more, this is a personal opinion of mine, I don't think many share it, but the more abstinent one actually kind of takes the education of the sex phenomenon, the more, if they must have it, they're willing to do it in the most undisciplined sort of ways, I think. Because I've heard instances of like people who are virgins by either not voluntary or voluntary, but what would happen is that if they say that, if the opportunity comes that I would have sex, I will not use a condom, and and based on their mental state, they're not going to use any other kinds of restraint like pulling out or anything like that, so the more anti-sex the mindset is, when they have to sin, so to speak, then they really run into some serious problems.
Yeah, because they're engaging in unprotected sex.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. In fact, there was some research that suggested that people who were religious were not actually less likely to have sex. They were just more likely to feel guilty about it, actually. So
That's
I
more
haven't got
the,
that.
yeah,
Yeah, I haven't got that research to hand, but I remember reading that a year or
yeah,
two ago. So it's, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, we in the West, we come from sort of I guess the preceding society was Victorian society, which is perceived as quite prudish. My book, by the way, as I've mentioned before to Vernon, is called The Victorian Fallacy. And the reason I picked that title is because people seem to think that history was a lot like the Victorian era. And well, first of all, it wasn't. And secondly, even the Victorian era wasn't that much like the Victorian era, because the Victorians would like to present this idea of prudishness, but there was some pretty wild stuff going on underneath the veneer of civility. But in any case, yeah, through history, people have engaged in sex, a lot, okay, or with whoever they wanted to in many cases. I mean, people historically, in fact, historically, a lot of societies had sex practices that would make us blush, right? So I think there's a perception today that our society is a bit wild when it comes to sex, but in some ways we're actually kind of a bit on the conservative side.
yeah.
But throughout history, non-monogamy has been common, and adultery has been common, and all these things have gone on in every society. So,
Yeah.
irrespective of the sort of the veneer they wanted to present to the world, like the Victorians did. So, but anyway, I just wanted to comment on that. In Middle Ages Europe, for example, it was very, very common, and this went right through to the Renaissance. It was very, very common for people who were engaged to begin a sexual relationship. So we tend to think of people in medieval Europe as being a bit prudish and being really anti-sex before marriage. In actual fact, to a large degree, once people got engaged, they usually began a sexual relationship at that point.
Sure.
So William Shakespeare's wife was pregnant on her wedding day, right? And it's been estimated by historians that about 30% of brides were pregnant on their wedding day in his time, in the sort of 17th century. So this was pretty common. People having sex and pregnant on their wedding day. All this sort of thing has been a fairly normal state. People tend to think this sort of thing's modern, but it's not.
Well, I wonder if it has to do with the fact that none of us are really comfortable with our ancestors having sex. So we're always imagining that. Well, we kind of have this imagination, this illusion that since we can't imagine them today doing such a thing, they must have never.
I hate to break it to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Right.
Yes. In fact, I like to one of my points I like to make in relation to essentially the drive for sex that is and how what a drive there is to have children and so forth to a large degree. I like to point out that each of us is the end result of 1 billion years of sexual reproduction. For 1 billion years, our ancestors have been sexually reproducing. That's a huge selective pressure in terms of the desire to reproduce and have children and all the rest of it.
Right, it's easy to take for granted, and
yes.
this is especially considering that creating children isn't the forefront in our mind as we engage in these sort of activities. We just want that kind of, ever since humanity's kind of entered into this existential phase about contemplating their own meaning and being aware of their own existence and becoming the sentient beings that we are. It's more about that sort of metaphysical catharsis, I suppose. I think that's been the more primary driving force of sexual activity, rather than I must reproduce.
Yeah, we don't think of it in those terms, but at some level it's happening. But yes, we don't consciously think of it in those terms.
Yeah, it's more deeper. It's more.
That's right. It's an underlying drive, but doesn't necessarily rise to the surface consciousness.
Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So it's good we've been able to talk about MGM there, which is an important point or an important issue that we're looking at in men's rights. I was talking to some activists a couple of years ago, and they were expressing a surprise that it was such an active area for us. And I showed them some videos from ICMI 16 and ICMI 17, and each speaker in the conferences has a banner right next to them. And right at the top, as I pointed out, for 16 and 17, the very first issue was male genital mutilation. So, and I think they were quite impressed and surprised by that, actually, to see that it was. And over the years, I said, I think there's been a move closer between the intactivists and men's rights, actually.
I'd like to think so. Like the intactivists seem to come from many, if not all, walks of life.
They do.
Yeah, that's probably the place I've seen the most ideological diversity in. So there's definitely that intersect between the men's rights and intactivists, but it is enough to consider them basically distinct but slightly overlapping movements, I suppose.
That's exactly right. That's right.
So,
I'd say, yeah, that's right. It is an overlap, exactly, where most MRAs will be intactivists, but only a minority of intactivists will be MRAs, which, by the way, is the same thing with anti-feminism too. So where there's plenty of anti-feminists who aren't involved in men's rights, but most people in men's rights would call themselves anti-feminists.
And that's the big thing that people need to realize, that, you know, just because somebody is anti-feminist doesn't mean they care about men.
No, exactly right. That's right. There's a lot of traditionalists who are very vehemently anti-feminist, but yes, they'll be the same ones who would draft men and send the men off to die in war while the women stayed home, perfectly safe. Exactly.
And circumcise them.
Yes.
Right. It's right. I mean, living in the United States, I just see these hypocrisies, you know, like glaring, and it feels like you don't have a home sometimes because you have to kind of be one or the other to be sure. It's very particular to America. I don't know how it is elsewhere.
And you mentioned Europe, how the rate is quite, and that's what I've heard a lot too. I've visited Europe. I've been to UK and Germany and France briefly, but I've never spent any substantial amount of time there. But talked to a lot of Europeans online, and that's the impression I get too, that it's quite rare, except for, say, there's a couple of immigrant communities who you know, got sort of who have that tradition, but for the most part, otherwise, it's relatively rare.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it does show too how rarely these days it's necessary, because that's another argument we hear. It was necessary as a medical treatment for phimosis, for example. For those who don't know, phimosis is a condition where the foreskin can't retract properly. It's actually relatively common. It's a very high proportion of young boys have some sort of phimosis, which I believe is not considered a problem below a certain age. It's generally only considered to be a diagnosable condition once a boy gets to about sort of 13, 14, 15, somewhere around there.
That sounds about right, yeah.
Yeah, so where the foreskin doesn't retract, if the foreskin doesn't retract beyond a certain point, it can cause some problems. But what they found is that treatments of what they actually call stretching exercise, which, believe it or not, is stretching the foreskin over the glands, penis, and some topical creams where they have the hormonal creams, I think, which assist. And one study found, I think 6 weeks was about the average time the vast majority of the boys were able to correct the problem within about 6 weeks, which is if you think about it, 6 weeks of sort of, you know, stretching exercises and some applying some cream is nothing compared to the severity of going through a circumcision operation. Also, too, there's a couple of procedures now that are available that in the past maybe they had to do a circumcision. Now they've actually got a couple of new procedures which they can use instead of a circumcision, and therefore this is if the stretching exercises have failed. One's called the dorsal slit, where they do a cut in the foreskin and basically make it easier to retract. And that's an alternative to, and you know, far less damaging than a circumcision.
This almost kind of blows out of the water that whole you know, circumcision where medically necessary. Almost, it's like this is, even that is a bit of a scam. It's like, you know, because I've heard of a lot of situations in which, you know, it was prematurely retracted, therefore supposedly necessitating the removal of and such. You know, right. So even that, I'm worried to say, you know, like I don't. I almost question the supposed medical necessities in any case, especially since we have these better, less invasive procedures, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And that's a good point you mentioned about the forced retraction. So, and this is a point the intactivists have been really great at basically driving and getting people to understand. attempting to retract the foreskin of a boy before it's ready can damage the foreskin, and then doctors have come along and said, well, now we'll circumcise as a result of the damaged foreskin. So, and the problem was caused by people doing something with the foreskin that it wasn't supposed to do at that age. So, yeah, the intactivists have been really good at encouraging parents to leave the foreskin alone when they're infants. So,
Absolutely.
and of course, then I don't know, Vernon, if we've ever talked about this, but it's been mentioned a few times on ABFM and so forth. I've mentioned in a couple of interviews. Foreskins are not destroyed as medical waste. Infant foreskins are not destroyed as medical waste. Some are used in medical research, but a high proportion of them go to the cosmetic industry.
That's what I'm seeing as well. And I think just straight off the top of my head, what's her name? Kate Beckinsale, and the other one, the one I always get
Sandra Bullock.
Sandra Bullock. That's the other one. Yeah. Right. So those are two big time people saying I got the penis facial. You know,
and I think Oprah may have done something too. Actually,
Oprah promoted it for at least. I don't know if she's a recipient herself. Well, I mean, I guess she has to be if she's a big proponent of it. But you know,
she did promote it, didn't she?
Yeah, right.
That's right, and that's right. They grow the material from infant male foreskins, and then they apply that. They basically produce the material, which is then put in the cream and applied to the face. And just it's awful. It really is absolutely awful that this is going on. And the hospitals are selling these foreskins. That's I think a lot of people don't realize too. The hospitals are selling these foreskins and they've got quite a nice side business going on. So the hospitals, American hospitals in particular, are incentivized to try to get parents to agree to a circumcision, because the hospital will then take that material and sell it.
Yeah, it's kind of, you can't be paranoid enough, right? I mean, when you think about anybody else that might have young sons, you know, kind of, you know, and they have to go to their pediatrist, you know, appointments and stuff like that. I'm just kind of like worried in the back of my head, like, well, God, is the parent going to have the willpower to say no to every attempt to kind of get at it, you know? Especially
when you've got someone in a position of authority claiming that this is the right course of action. You've got doctors, as you say, and specialists and so forth. Yeah,
exactly. Right.
Yes. So it is, but I believe even in the US, the rate is declining. Is that right?
I want to think so. Right. Yeah. I need to see the figures again. It's kind of hard to see which figures are more authentic, though. Yeah. It's kind of hard to trust. For me, it's hard to trust which media is the more objective kind of deals, or which one's propaganda. It's really hard to tell, you know. So
no, fair enough. Yeah, and it's an interesting point you mentioned about regional variations. Once you found that out, I'd be interested to see that. Actually, they will probably make a good article for A Voice for Men. Actually,
yeah, I hope I can find some straight objective research on that one. To be sure. Yeah.
So. I think for this, for this series of videos, we're going to talk about all sorts of topics. So we've talked about circumcision, a lot of male genital mutilation. One final point I'll mention, I think probably we might move on to another topic if we've got something else we're looking at. Male genital circumcision, what we normally call circumcision, is not intrinsically less damaging than female genital mutilation. So in fact, they've rated the different forms of genital mutilation, and male genital mutilation, circumcision, is about halfway up actually. So about half of the forms of female genital mutilation are more severe, and about half are less severe. So both MGM and FGM are, of course, extremely damaging. And we're in general for MRAs, and A Voice for Men is explicitly looking at MGM and FGM MGM being made illegal alongside FGM. FGM is already illegal, but yeah, basically we want both forms to be illegal.
Absolutely. This is one thing I'm very much for making illegal, to be sure, because strictly on the basis that it is a violent act perpetrated on a helpless being, basically.
Exactly. That's right. A tiny infant who
Right.
can't consent or even understand what's going on,
Yeah.
and they're removing part of his body. I think if you take a step back and sort of step back from the culture of it, it's absolutely extraordinary that this is okay in the 21st century, that anyone's doing this.
Well, sure. Well, I've been trying to mull over what's actually kind of keeping this going, right? Most people say it's because there's money in it, but they're not talking about why it makes the money. Right, that money's just a tool to make things happen, but there aren't in itself the problem, right? The real problem, I would say, is just the fact that nobody really cares, even to this day, that boys get hurt for being boys, compared to girls, and they, they would say things like, he took it like a champ or anything like that. At 7 days of age, he took it like a champ, so to speak. And so, yeah, right. So I said before in the past, why not throw him against the brick wall, see if he survives, and that's it. Might as well just do that, right? Right.
Yeah.
But right.
Hurting the poor infant anyway. Yeah. But this brings up a good point, actually, which sort of even segues into another topic we were looking at, talking about misandry. We refer to this as the empathy gap. Now, obviously, feminists have talked about things like the wage gap, and we're happy to debunk that. There's an earnings gap. Yes, men on average earn more than women, although even that's not always true now. But overall, it is true. But it's an earnings gap, not a wage gap. But anyway, there is one genuine gap. There is the empathy gap, where both men and women tend to intrinsically care less about men than women.
Right. And it gets reinforced by the idea that, women are more intrinsically valuable in the biological context and the metaphysical context, even how they're supposedly this divine feminine. We rarely talk about the divine masculine, if such a thing even is ever postulated. But but in both physical and metaphysical terms, the gyneolatry is real.
Yes, exactly. That's right. Exactly. In fact, the term we often use at A Voice for Men is gynocentrism, as we've discussed many times, where a preponderant view of basically looking at society from a position of putting women at the center, where the argument being that it's not just biological, but the argument being that we need women to survive in order to reproduce, and if we lose our women, our society won't be able to reproduce, and so forth. But I've made the point that there are 8 billion humans now. So even if we were in the past at risk of extinction, or had to protect women in order to allow the community to survive, I think there are so many people now that even if that view was valid in the past, I don't think it's valid anymore.
Right. I would even go in and say that there may be something we don't know about the past that maybe even then it wasn't really necessary. It was just they were imitating some pre-human natures, or they came up with some misguided conclusions that allowed so many male deaths. Maybe the male deaths weren't the thing that sustained in the name of female survival. Maybe none of this was necessary. I'm a bit nutty here, but
it's an interesting area to look at. I mean, so you're basically arguing that maybe even historically that probably was. I think you're saying maybe not as important as we tend to assume it was.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think they were just going by some really false pretenses. I think I mean, I'm pretty sure I'll get a lot of disagreement from people on this one, because
it's a great topic to discuss, and it's one we've posted articles on at A Voice for Men many times and discussed. Right. There's differing views there about the extent to which the survival of women needs to be prioritized in order for a community or species to survive. For example,
sure.
I mean, if you lose males, you still lose genetic diversity. That's, by the way, I believe is the reason why most species have 1-to-1 male and female gender, because if you think about it, if you just needed to prioritize the survival of women, then why not have 90% female? Because you could,
Exactly.
fertilize with 10% of male. And the reason that I have seen proposed is that the 1-to-1 ratio maximizes genetic diversity. So you need both. Yes, in a mammal species where women have a womb, they are the bottleneck of reproduction, but you still need a large number of males in order to be able to keep that genetic diversity going.
Yeah, and speaking of diversity, I kind of really want to call out these people who say that you only need, one man to inseminate like a bunch of women in a tribe or something like that. Well, how incestuous an argument is that? I mean, we're making, a tribe full of half brothers and half sisters here.
Yeah, the next generation, they're all going to be related to one another. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. So there's an interesting study that came out, maybe 20 years ago now, that claimed that historically 80% of women reproduced and only 40% of men did. Now, after that, another study came out saying that was wrong, and then another study came out saying that was wrong, and the original one was right. And this has been bouncing backwards and forwards. And we've even had, in some of the men's rights groups I've been in, there've even been some pretty heated discussions on this particular topic about exactly how accurate it is. And I must admit, I've kind of taken a wait and see attitude with this, and I'm sort of sitting back and seeing what the research comes up with. But it's an interesting argument as to what proportion of men managed to reproduce versus what proportion of women did. Were polygamous relationships relatively common in the past? People, anthropologists have looked at this too, about polygamous relationships and how likely they were to occur and so forth. I've heard a few argue that they weren't actually that. They're relatively rare, even in societies that allow them. Most men don't have multiple wives.
Well, that's the sort of thing that I kind of always boil down to what I would call the economics of one's own time, right? Because when we're speaking about things like polygamy and stuff, and how historically that's the kind of thing that was going on or something like that. Well, who has the resources to maintain such a polygamous relationship, especially if it's like one to many? If it's a one-to-many relationship, like many to many, I can kind of understand how it could be more nuanced, but I'm thinking about applying the context in the modern day, and it's got to be so expensive to do. It's like, like, why would you even want to? Right.
There's actually an American TV show, I don't know if you've ever seen it, called Big Love, which basically goes into that. So Big Love is it's about a gentleman who's part of a Mormon sect. I know the Mormon sect, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints don't like the word Mormon, I think, but I describe it as perhaps a Mormon sect where they're maintaining, unlike the mainstream church, they're maintaining polygamous relationships. And one aspect they actually go into is that this guy's basically financially strained by the fact he's got 3 wives, and he's really under quite a lot of stress. And the show's sort of a drama comedy, and a lot of the humor revolves, particularly the first couple of years, revolves around the fact that this guy is having to basically bust a gut to keep 3 wives and 6 or 7 kids or 10 kids or something.
Right. Well, if everybody, men and women, were more of a modernized, financially independent kind of state, maybe this sort of could, I would even entertain the idea that it might work, but we're not anywhere close to that right now because women like to think they're more on the independent side of things, but there's so much assistance in terms of finances and taxes that kind of go into them that it's almost to the point that men are the ones that practically exclusively pay all the taxes in a society, right? And where is it going to, right?
So I like to point out that most of the people who are claiming they're independent are only independent within the context of an industrialized society.
True.
So there are very, very few people, men or women, who are genuinely independent. And in fact, if you look at the ones, there's been a few actually TV shows about people who are living in the wilderness and so forth. The overwhelming numbers of people who choose that lifestyle are male, from what I can see.
Sure.
But even then, it's only a relatively small proportion of the male population who choose that level. Yet for the rest of us, we're nice and safe. And as you say, we if we get in trouble, emergency services will come and help us. And there's all sorts of resources and support available. And you make a very good point about taxation. So the bulk of taxation is actually paid by men. and the bulk of services are actually used by women. So society taxation to a large degree is actually transfer of wealth from men to women in Western civilization. That's actually true. So you could argue there, and I'm sure people have argued that there are perhaps legitimate reasons why that is the case and so forth, but that is the reality that we have in society, which I think a lot of men wouldn't have a problem with that, actually, except for the fact that our society is so misandric and attacks men. So
exactly,
we maintain it and we're attacked. So they're not even thanked for it anymore.
Yeah, sure. And I'm the kind of guy that said, see, here's the thing. I'm not advocating for an exit from industrialized society per se, right? I think kind of a back and forth is kind of nice, and kind of having your feet in both areas is probably the better thing to do. But if we make taxation into not taxation, make it actual voluntary contributions, because I come from a very libertarian stance on this sort of thing, right? Like services paid for voluntarily on their own time, that sort of thing. I think it might change the state of things, but I don't think it'll mean the end of industrialization either. So that's just something worth thinking about. Maybe that could be a step towards actually lighting a fire under women's asses to actually contribute something, and so to speak.
So so from a libertarian point of view, you're more in favor of lower taxation and so forth, which of course the US actually has lower taxation than, say, Australia. We're not Australia, by the way, is not the most taxed country in the world, despite what some Australians will tell you. When I went to Canada, almost as soon as I got there, I heard Canada's the most taxed country in the world. That's not true either.
Okay.
If you want to go to the most taxed country in the world, you're probably looking at Belgium or the Netherlands, actually, I think, and also Scandinavian countries.
I've heard Denmark was pretty well taxed.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. That's right. Right. So they tend to have very high tax rates relative to even other industrialized countries. But in any case, yes. So it's interesting to look at how different societies have done it. Most Australians, for example, I think, are fairly okay with the arrangement we have in terms of services that are provided by the government. But as I said, it really comes down to the fact that an increasing number of people, not just men, are objecting to the society being so misandric and attacking men. And here the men are working 40, 50 years, contributing significantly to the system, and the bulk of taxation through the system, and then the system is actually attacking them, or in the case of the family courts, they're funding the system, which is essentially destroying their lives.
Yeah, funding into the system that's sabotaging the very benefactors, so to speak.
Exactly. Yeah. By the way, there is hard data on this. We have this on A Voice for Men. There's a study that was released in New Zealand which looked at taxation, and what they found in New Zealand was, and this should be fairly applicable to other countries, men were essentially revenue neutral, where the amount of money that men were putting into the system was about roughly, over their lives, was roughly the amount that they were taking out. The women were being paid about 150,000 New Zealand dollars more each than they were putting into the system over their life, which sounds to me like the only reason the New Zealand system was staying afloat was essentially economic growth. That the system was getting, the economy was growing. Otherwise, they probably couldn't be able to afford those sort of numbers. But I think it's fairly typical of others, I suspect, at least of Western countries.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the problems of socialism, but we're not talking about how gendered socialism actually is, it seems. So,
that's right, exactly. And as I think a lot of men would, historically at least, were okay with this arrangement. It came with respect, but the respect is gone now. But we still have the obligation on the men, and of course the fact that it's been the resources then being turned against them in many cases, but they're still paying, and now the system attacks them. So,
yeah. Well, what are we going to do about that?
Yeah. Well, exactly. So I argue that MGTOW. So for anyone who doesn't know, MGTOW is men going their own way. In some ways, it's an allied movement to men's rights. I describe it as basically MGTOW. So there are lots of different groups who will recognize the problems. And I describe it as MGTOW essentially disengaging. MRAs are saying, let's try to fix this problem. There are various other groups as well there are PUAs, pickup artists, who also to a large degree actually agree with, recognize the problems. And they basically decided to just have as much sex as possible while Rome burns is pretty much their solution to or non-solution to the problem. So the MRAs are trying to fix it. MGTOW are disengaging, but I've argued that MGTOW is an economic weapon, that if enough men disengage, it will ultimately deprive the system of the tax base that is itself being used to attack men.
My interpretation of MGTOW is pretty consistent with what you just mentioned here. In fact, I would say that MGTOW is more of a men living for their own sake. That's another way I can say, yeah, I mean, that's what going your own way is. It's doing what you want with your own life, not beholden to someone else's expectations. So in short, it's just men's independence. It's just men's liberation.
That's right.
Yeah, and imagine being against that.
some MGTOW do deliberately minimize their work and so forth to sort of essentially disengage with the system to a certain extent. And yeah, it can mean that they just pursue their own interests. But there are others who most MGTOW, and this would be the generally accepted definition, do not maintain long-term relationships with women. There are some who actually argue they're MGTOW, they say they are MGTOW and do have long-term relationships with women, but that would be a small minority.
Sure.
So to a large degree, they're not. But some of them disengage economically as well, and yeah, even deliberately go out of their way to minimize their involvement in the system and the amount of tax that they're paying and so forth. And
yeah,
deliberately work part-time rather than full-time. And that goes back to, of course, balancing with their interests and so forth. They've got plenty of time to pursue their own interests and so forth.
Yeah, it sounds like a market solution to the problem.
That's right.
Yeah.
And also and I mentioned this on a Reddit post a little while ago. It's something I've been sort of, I guess, mentioning over the last year mainly. I thought about this and I realized that I think MGTOW is also a sex strike. So it's interesting because feminists keep saying, I mean, I spend a lot of time collating this data and posting it, and because people tend to forget, I know, particularly with the 24-hour news cycle, you'll hear something and then you'll move on and so forth. But if you really start to record these things, you can start to see these patterns. And over the last 10 years or so, there have been a lot of calls for sex strikes. Feminists have been keep calling for sex strikes among women. And it's I posted out on Twitter recently to a feminist who was doing this, said, a sex strike again? We just got over the last one,
Yeah.
But anyway, I think while this has been going on, and I think there's plenty of evidence that, and I've got some data on Wiki for Men about this, and I'll be putting some stuff on A Voice for Men. I think the vast majority of sex strikes don't happen, and they don't achieve their aims, even to the extent that they do happen. Meanwhile, MGTOW, I think, is a sex strike. I think men have actually been have basically just very quietly initiated the sex strike.
What's very consistent with that is that, with MGTOW being a sex strike, like these women sex strikers, I think you know where I'm going with this, but they've been on thin ice, because like the advent of sex dolls, sex robots, they're coming, and I assume that MGTOW may, maybe they don't have to be MGTOW, but a lot of them could gravitate towards that instead. That's where they choose to put their money in. That really is in effect like a sex strike.
Yes, and you're right about the sex dolls and so forth, and they're becoming more and more realistic, and even in the last 10 years, there's been a huge explosion. Actually, Mike Buchanan actually did a video on sex dolls and so forth a while back. So it's an area that's I think getting quite a little bit more interest. And it is interesting that this is occurring at the same time that we've got feminists arguing that women should be going and engaging in sex strikes and so forth. So I do think that we could even potentially be looking at a perfect storm. We've already got a very low birth rate, and we may yet see it go lower.
To be absolutely sure. I mean, we were freaking out before about overpopulation and such.
That's
but
right.
Clearly it appears to be the opposite.
Absolutely. In fact, I think probably even a lot of people listening may not be aware, because it's happened so quickly, that even 5-10 years ago, the concern was, that the world's population might top out at something like 11 billion. It might be static at that point, or it might continue to rise slightly. And particularly over the last 10 years, there's this sort of growing body of evidence to suggest, in actual fact, we might be looking at at a population crash. And I think it's even in the last 5 years, increasingly looking like that's likely, that sometime in the 21st century, the world's population could decline. Because even the developing world, historically, the developed world, in the last few decades at least, the developed world had a relatively low birth rate and got sub-breed reproduction. But the developing world still had a high birth rate. But at the present time, everywhere pretty much outside Africa, the birth rate is now dropping significantly. And we could see in large parts of the developing world, the developing world, also have their population decline. That would see the whole world's population decline.
Yeah, it's simply not a net positive to actually get engaged in this sort of thing. It's like, many people I've seen like more traditionalist types say that, oh, pornography is to blame, or nobody's having sex to reproduce or something like that. But I don't think I think that's short-sighted. I think because those are more alternatives to the problem. I think, which is, yeah, right. I mean, yeah, gynocentrism causes population decline. Yeah. I mean, everybody's saying like, the men really need to step up and have families. Well, okay, what's disincentivizing?
Yeah, that's right. And this is where it comes back to something like the MGTOW, where a lot of them are choosing not to have children. And by the way, many of them will say they want to have kids, but they just feel in the current circumstances, it's not a realistic option for them for a variety of reasons and the way that society is treating men. So I think that's a big difference too between the MGTOW, and they often get compared to extreme feminists but the MGTOW to a large degree will say we'd like to have kids, but we just can't, and here are the reasons.
Yeah.
Versus the extreme feminists, where they say, "Oh no, we don't want to have kids," or whatever. So, yeah, I think it's interesting. We will see that we are seeing that occurring.
Yeah, it's definitely worth exploring because so I want to go on a bit of a tangent here. If we still have time, by the way, I'm assuming we can go on for a little bit more.
That's right.
Yeah. People say that, so there's a lot of talk about feminism being on the decline in places like Japan and China and such, right? Like the women are flat out rejecting it, so, and that's well and good, right? But why is there still a low birth rate in places like Japan? Yes. Japan's known for it, right? So there must be a gynocentrism there anyway, even though the feminism is allegedly declining. So feminism is not the only problem.
So it's interesting. I'm glad you mentioned Japan, because I was going to mention, ask you a little bit more about Japan too. So we hear about the grass-eating men in Japan. Now, my understanding of that is that for particularly a couple of generations in the post-World War II, you had the salaryman who was basically working himself to death in Japan. And you've got a younger generation of men coming up and saying, you know what? I've seen that happen to my father and my grandfather, and I don't want that life anymore. So some people have argued that it's a parallel to MGTOW. I don't know, having lived in Japan, what are your thoughts on the grass-eating men?
I think it's, I don't know how consciously it is the same philosophy behind MGTOW, but I think the idea is the same. It's so in comparison to, I guess, more, would you say that in the Western world, people don't really expect much from boys?
Yep.
Okay. Now, in the Eastern world, it's a bit of an opposite. We expect so much to excess, from our children, and I think a lot of this has to do with burnout.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because I've heard of people who are able to actually make a decent living just stuck in their homes and doing some kind of web work and stuff like that. And so, aside from getting some food, they don't step out of their rooms really. And most of them are quite all right with that. It's like socialization and engaging with women it becomes a net negative for these kind of people.
Well, in fact, there is a phenomenon in Japan where, and I think it is predominantly but not exclusively male, where there are young guys who essentially don't leave their rooms at all. Isn't that right? And
they're called the hikikomori, kind of like hold up sort of. Like there's been cases in which it gets so bad that they take over their house and kick out some of their own family. That's an extreme case, but like, yeah, they actually board up their own houses and kick out any other family members, and of course, this doesn't happen out of nowhere, right? I mean, a lot of these cases are from fatherless homes or something like that, where the father is kind of absent, and the mother just wonders what the hell's the problem here. So, but in other cases, they're expected to perform from a young age. They barely see friends and just be children. Instead they're going off to cram school and stuff like that. I've had many friends that went to cram schools. I couldn't hang out with them, but they're expected to perform highly. It's such a big culture surrounding that, and that kind of thing's has been bleeding into South Korea as well, by the way. I'm not as much of a knowledgeable person on South Korea. I'm speaking more in terms of my Japanese experience here, but yeah, and if they don't get their big choice of college sometimes, or they just fail in other areas, they crash.
Right.
They emotionally crash, and all this has been for nothing, kind of deal.
Yeah. And then that's the point once they start to hole up in their room, is it? And then or they stay in the house and refuse to go out. Wow.
Yeah.
And there's some evidence that we're seeing it in other countries. I've just recently heard some reports that this may be starting to appear in other countries. So I do think everyone else should be looking at the Japanese experience and looking to see what the Japanese are trying to do about it, and maybe even learning from them. So because we may yet see more of this occurring. But a really good point about that. There's certainly from my experience, having grown up in Australia, and a lot of people from East Asia, for example, moved here. For example, when Hong Kong was looking at being handed over to China, there was a huge influx of people from Hong Kong, and so I knew a lot of people from East Asia, and there really was that pressure to perform in a lot of East Asian cultures in terms of school and so forth. Often the kids who had come from Hong Kong in particular would be the top 3 or 4 in the class, and they were up studying 3-4 hours a night, and we weren't, and this sort of, this is an early high school and so forth. And I do see that there does seem to be a phenomenon that is across East Asian cultures to a large degree, and it does put enormous pressure on the children. And I think that's sad. I suppose as for Western culture, there is much more of a view of being a child, spending your child, being a child, having the childhood and having the balance and so forth. But it is a shame that occurs, and that the pressure that puts on the poor children, and that so you're basically suggesting that that's then why we're now seeing this phenomenon appear.
I think it's a big part. Yeah. Like, people wonder why this happens, but they aren't really to face some hard facts.
Yeah. It's really worrying, and I said that I just recently, last year or two, I've heard of some reports that this may be appearing in other countries. So I think we should all be taking a great interest in what's going on in Japan and how they're dealing with it, actually.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and I think getting back to population too. So Japan's population, has it started to decline, or is it still growing? I don't know if you know offhand.
That's something I need to kind of do more studies on, but the common trope about Japan is that it's always declining, and there's less and less children all the time. I think it's been a long time coming, but it's just steady and down. Like, if it's a spike, I guess I'll find out, but I'm assuming it'll be big news.
The population declines, there's a delay, like the birth rate drops, and then later on the population declines. So it's interesting. I did look at Japan a little while ago, and I thought it either was close or maybe had started to decline, but I'm not 100%. But Russia, interestingly enough, just earlier today, I was having a look, and I was reminded that during the peak of the Cold War, the population of the USSR, Russia in the USSR was about 200 million or something, and it's down to 143 million now. So Russia's population has declined. They did pick up a little bit there for a little while, but it started to decline again, I think. So we are seeing countries, that are starting to decline outside the West. And of course, the West props up its population with immigration to a large degree, or Australia would have a declining population now if we didn't have the massive immigration we've got. Same with Canada. The US lasted a bit longer, but I think the US birth rate is now dropping to the point where if it wasn't for immigration, the population would start to decline.
Yeah, absolutely. And then speaking of that, I guess another factor is playing in is that, in the name of cultural identity and national purity, there, for all practical purposes, there isn't really an open, I don't mean open, but like an active immigration policy in places like Japan, right? Like you're not, like if you're not Japanese, you're not a citizen, basically.
Yeah.
And you'll never fit in. That's the attitude that these people have, and and it's so tied into their race. I was having a conversation yesterday with some other people. You'll see that ahead of time, but just this idea that racism. You think the Western world is so racist and such, right? But not nearly as racist as the Asian countries. Right.
And a lot of other parts of the world too, in all honesty. There are some very racist parts of the world. Middle Eastern countries, for example, still treat sub-Saharan Africans absolutely abominably.
Sure.
And Libya, I mean, they had, and this is an area I want to talk about actually, because they had sub-Saharan African men on the auction block in Libya within the last 10 years, within the last 5 to 10 years. Where, as Libyan society had a series of problems there in recent years, they had chattel slavery again, selling sub-Saharan men on the auction block, just like they did, 100, 200 years ago. I mean, slavery obviously has never gone away. It's still around.
Right.
There are more people in play now. But go on.
But I was wondering if so you would then argue that it's almost more common today than it was.
Well, it is. There are more people. There are more people enslaved today than any point in history, but as a proportion of the population, it's relatively small. I think around 40 million people are enslaved at the moment.
Okay, I'm actually going to go ahead. Sorry.
No, and a significant proportion are men, and it's not talked about.
Well, yeah. So that's one thing, and another thing I think is that we had this kind of idea that only white people can enslave blacks or something like that, and so that contributes to the ignorance about how it happens in other ways, and that's how it kind of goes run away with it. It's
interesting you mentioned that, because being the history geek I am, I've always had a fascination with history, and I've pretty much read as much as I could growing up. And so I always knew that slavery was common. Essentially, my view, by the way, is that slavery is essentially a function of agriculture. So slavery seems to appear when agriculture gets established. And when industrialization comes along, it becomes uneconomical. So it's notable that societies almost always decide that slavery is morally wrong just after it becomes uneconomical.
Yeah, it's almost... they haven't considered the moral implications of slavery
until it's not worth it anymore, and then they go, that's terrible. We got to ban that. Kind of riding the bandwagon instead of actually being principled. That's exactly right. So so it is slavery, one form or another, has pretty much been with any agricultural society, and whether that's in Africa or in Europe or in Asia, or wherever it happens to be, slavery was there. I mean, the Barbary states are a great example. They were essentially North African groups, and they would prey on Europeans. They once depopulated an entire Irish village. The village happened to be called Boston, by the way.
Oh, sure.
Sorry, Baltimore. My mistake, Baltimore. I knew it's the same name as in Baltimore. Sorry,
not Boston.
So, not Boston, Baltimore. So the Irish town of Baltimore, the slavers from the Barbary states came in, and I think there were 2 or 3 people who were out of the village at the time. They were the only people from that village who didn't get carted into slavery in North Africa. They think that for about 400 years, Europeans avoided building their villages on the coastline, too close to the coastline, because raids from the Barbary states was such a serious problem. So this has been a common theme through human culture for thousands of years. And continues to this day.
Yeah, sure. And I think a lot of it just boils down to the lack of regard for the individualism of all men and women, too. But I guess this idea that humans are means to others' ends, and I accuse most forms of common morality of perpetuating this by accident. So I think it's no wonder it's been so constant, I think.
Yeah. And it did. Sort of, it was integrated into many societies. I mean, the Romans were a classic example. By the way, a lot of slavery historically wasn't racial at all, or was it?
Sure,
It
yeah,
wasn't. Yeah. So if you went to a slave market in the Roman Republic or something like that, you would see people from across the Republic and neighboring areas. Often it was
sure,
people captured in war and so
yeah.
forth,
The
and sold as
losers, as it
spies.
were.
The
Yeah,
losers, exactly. That's
yeah,
right. That's right. So you would see people from England all the way through to Africa and so forth in the slave market. Yeah, this is an area I want to talk a bit more about. There's a problem in Southeast Asia. Getting back to this is more
yeah.
Southeast Asia rather than East Asia, but
Okay.
Thailand in particular.
Mm.
There's a big problem where men in particular will go to say Thailand from some of the poorer countries in the region like Laos, looking for better economic opportunities, and these guys will basically be captured, and they will actually chain them to fishing boats, right? Then sail
Uh-huh.
them out into the
Yeah.
into the sea. These fishing boats will not go to land for years. They will actually basically keep fishing, and when they've got a full catch, another ship will come up and load it onto the bigger ship, which will then go back into port. And these guys, they're stuck on these ships for years at a time, not
Mm.
seeing land, and
I
it's
see.
overwhelmingly men that this is happening to.
Yeah.
And this is the Thai fishing fleet. Here in Australia, we get seafood from Thailand, for example, and some of that seafood is sourced from slave labor. So I think we should be should be starting to look at like they've done with chocolate. We should be looking at tracking the supply chain for things like seafood, and getting companies to certify that they don't have slave labor, because this is overwhelmingly men who are out in the entire fishing fleets, for example, being at sea for years and years at a time, never
Yeah.
seeing land, chained to the ship. They chain them to the ship whenever the other ship would come up to offload the catch, so they couldn't escape, and they're there and just basically worked to death on these
I,
ships.
I think that's the sort of thing that's worth encapsulating in some graphics and such, so you can kind of disseminate it more towards people, not just the men's rights movement, of course.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a good
and,
point, actually.
I mean, everybody's going on about animal cruelty and like products and stuff like that, but they don't consider things like slave labor and even the jewelry market. I hear about blood diamonds.
Blood diamonds.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and even I don't know how to kind of trace it back. So for someone like me, this will be good education, to know which ones to avoid, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's right. For those who don't know, of course, the term blood diamonds refers to the fact that the diamond trade is notorious for exploitative behavior. So, I mean, we can make diamonds in labs now, of course. The diamond industry has gone to a great extent to encourage people to buy real diamonds that are dug up from the ground, not ones that are made in labs. But I have to say, if a diamond's been made in a lab, then I know nobody was murdered to get it to me. So maybe a diamond made in a lab is better, actually. Versus,
Oh yeah,
I know the diamond industry claims to have cleaned up their act a lot, but I'm still pretty suspicious about what's going on.
It's hard to take them at the word, isn't it?
Yeah,
Right.
that's right.
And the same thing for, I think there's some components on our smartphone technologies that are likewise, traced to these kind of things, and things like components for electric cars even. Yeah, sure. We're not calling this sort of thing a men's issue, even though it is the men who are basically kind of targeted for this sort of thing in droves, right?
Right.
So this leads me to think that men are, in gynocentric society, men are not seen as a group, they're seen as a generic, in which a woman is a more enhanced version that deserves special attention if something bad were to happen to them. So males then become this blank slate almost.
Yeah, well, feminists often point out that we live in a society where there's a default male. They'll often point out, for example, they'll give an example of Pac-Man, and then the female version has a bow to indicate she's female, so the default was male. Okay.
Yes.
But in actual fact, they're tending to assume that puts men in the superior position. I don't think that's true at all.
Oh, no.
yeah, that default position is often a very, as you say, generic position, and the special version is the female version. Historically, many societies viewed women as morally superior to men. European societies certainly did, right through the Middle Ages. Essentially, women were considered to be the more moral version of men, and that certainly even comes through to the present time.
Yeah.
And I think personally, I think that's a fairly questionable claim. I think there's probably not such a great difference as some people claim, but that is something, yeah, many societies have claimed over the years.
Yeah. And even in cartoons and stuff like that, there's like this cartoon animal with no clothes on, but a female counterpart will be at least given a dress,
Yes.
So she has at least that privilege of being clothed.
Yeah, that's right. I do think that the default male is not beneficial or advantageous to males. The feminists, I tend to argue that it's intrinsically advantageous. To give us an example of patriarchy, actually, but I don't think the default male position, I don't think is at all beneficial to men to a large degree. Special versions.
Yeah, and you know what this reminds me of? The whole gripe about surnames, like feminists go on about how I'm not going to take my husband's name if I were to marry or something like that. But here's the problem. If a woman takes a man's surname, it's more closer not to her losing her identity, so to speak, by her name, but rather appropriating the man's identity, and then his property and his genetics and his labor. So that's why I think being Mrs. Male name is more of a position of privilege than the other way around.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that, actually. Yeah.
And plus, what are these feminists going to do? Like, take on their own dad's name, and if not, then what are you going to take his grandfather's name? Unless you can trace your matrilineal heritage like all the way down, it's pointless.
And that's a great term you just mentioned there, matrilineality. Yeah. So that's something I encourage everyone to look up if they don't know what it means. If a society inherits titles and inherits wealth through the male line, it is said to be patrilineal. If it inherits its titles and wealth through the female line, it is said to be matrilineal. There are plenty of patrilineal and plenty of matrilineal societies. Our society happens to be patrilineal, which is why the names are inherited from men. Ancient Egyptian society was matrilineal. So I've often heard, and you often hear people say, this society was matriarchal, that society was matriarchal. When they say that, they almost always mean something like matrilineal. There's a few other cases, a few other terms too, but I find that a lot of people misuse the term matriarchy in that regard, and they really meant a matrilineal society.
Yeah, right.
There are only, I think they're right in the sort of 3,000-year history of Egypt, of pharaonic Egypt, there were only about 3 female pharaohs, I think. So it obviously wasn't a matriarchy, but it was a matrilineal society.
Yeah.
And so that's one funny side effect of that, actually, of course, is Pharaoh was the husband of the woman who sort of was at the end of that line, right? And so many men would marry their own sisters in order to get control. So their father had been Pharaoh, and his oldest daughter, her husband, would be the next Pharaoh. So they would marry the brother and the sister off so that the son would end up the next pharaoh.
Right. Like something that just popped into my head. We always talk about, peasants and poor people kind of inbreeding with each other like that, but it's more like a aristocratic sort of a deal, isn't it?
That's right. It is, actually. That's right. You see this with Europe too, of course, where you had the royal houses of Europe being so interrelated, where you had things like haemophilia famously turning up in the Russian royal family, for example, and so that's right. It is more of a problem, I think, with aristocrats in a lot of cases. But yeah, so that's where that comes from, of course, that our society was historically patrilineal, and so the name was inherited down the male line. But that's all it meant. I mean, there are plenty of matrilineal societies around the world. There are various other aspects like matrifocality and matrilocality that I talk about in some of my speeches with ICMI.
Yeah, and wasn't And wasn't Paul Elam the one who said that, what we generally call patriarchy, what we also likewise mean is patrilineality, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so,
That's almost always what it means. Yeah. And I like to make the point that people kind of lack the vocabulary to describe what they mean, and so they use the terms matriarchy and patriarchy incorrectly, when they really should be talking about things like patrilineality and vocality and locality. So there are societies that are matrilocal, for example, where husbands move to their wives' family.
Oh, sure.
Whereas more societies have been patrilocal, where wives move to the husband's family. But there are some that are matrilocal, for example. They're still not matriarchies, but they are matrilocal. And there's that sort of thing. And I encourage everyone who's with interest in this to understand these terms, these correct terms, to describe what they're talking about, instead of misusing patriarchy and matriarchy.
Yeah, it seems like people kind of take, and so one side takes and runs with a certain limited set of vocabulary and make outlandish claims, but then the reaction to that commits a similar error, in which you then take that thing that they ran away with and say that it is the opposite, I suppose. Like one example I've seen recently is the word autonomy, right? Because in the wake of the whole Roe versus Wade thing, everybody's screeching about autonomy. Now, I think that what they really want is for men to pay for abortions, for killing fetuses, but that's not autonomy, right? Because you're not the one really in charge of it, right? At the very least. But then some traditionalists, some of the anti-abortion people who I agree with them about the whole anti-abortion thing, but they would proceed to go on and say that autonomy is not actually a good thing. Committing that same error of the misuse of the term. So what is
using the term autonomy?
Right. Yeah. Right. I've seen those on the right actually speaking against the idea of autonomy, which that's not right either. So
that's a good point, actually.
Yeah.
In fact, regarding terms like matriarchy and patriarchy, I've seen people on both sides. You made a really good point. I've seen people on both sides of this argument misuse the term. So I've seen plenty of people on the men's rights side who have misunderstood these terms, and that's why over the last few years I've made it my mission to sort of spread information on these terms, to get people to understand the terminology and be able to describe it a little better. But yes, there's plenty of people, even within broader anti-feminism, who don't understand the terminology.
Yeah. I mean, I realize that some people kind of jokingly say that they're the patriarchy or something like that, but sometimes that line kind of gets blurred. Maybe it's kind of hard to tell sometimes whether they actually mean it or not.
That's right. I don't do that joke at all.
I don't bother with it.
People who do. No, I prefer to say no. Actually, to stick to the line pointing out no. In actual fact, so my position is that there are essentially no true patriarchies or matriarchies historically. I think that all societies, you have fecality, locality, and lineality as three different important areas, and societies have had those in various combinations.
Yes.
And you've had societies like the Misao in China, an interesting example. Feminists have liked to hold them up as an example of a matriarchy. Now I believe they are matrilineal, matrilocal, and matrifocal. Okay. But still not a matriarchy, because I've researched them and they had kings historically. So obviously they weren't a matriarchy because they had
sure.
Right? But they've apparently in recent years even played this up a bit. And this is something we've seen a few times over the last few decades. They are playing it up for tourism. We should never forget this effect of tourism. They are now apparently playing this up as having been a matriarchy because it's drawing tourists.
I'm sorry, I'm drawing tourists where again?
To the Misao community in China.
Misao community. Okay, sure.
Yeah. So the area where they live in China is attracting tourism because this idea has been spreading.
Yeah.
And they're now playing it up. And there are a few examples of this actually, where you see society sort of start to play up some aspect of their culture a little bit more because it's drawing in tourists.
Yeah, Salem witch trials comes to mind.
Actually, it's an interesting example, actually, Salem, where they tried to, for a long time, the towns tried to sort of suppress knowledge of this until they realized that they'd make a lot more money if they...
Which, does Chernobyl have tourism there?
They did before
They
the
did?
war. Yes, absolutely they did. You can go to Chernobyl, or could go. You can't do it now, but you could go
Oh
to
yeah,
Chernobyl,
yeah, yeah.
and they had tours into the restricted zone.
Oh sure.
So I think it was half an hour near the reactor or something like that. So they timed it so it was relatively safe, and you couldn't eat anything while you were there because it's dangerous to eat stuff in
Yeah.
with radiation exposure. But absolutely, yeah, they did before the war. You could go to Ukraine and book a tour of
Oh
Chernobyl, where they,
yeah.
you'd drive there and only be in the zone for, I think it was about 30 minutes or something like that. So it was relatively safe.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And although there's so much nuance that deserves to be applied to things like patrilineality, matrilineality, and those kind of things, I still think that gynocentrism is still more prevalent and is all over the place and throughout history for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. Peter Wright argues that in Western culture it appeared in the Middle Ages. There are others who have argued that it's essentially intrinsic to some form. I probably sit somewhere in the middle. I think it's probably partially innate, but we've promoted it culturally a lot. But yes, it absolutely is real, demonstrably real. It's
Right.
all you have to do is sit back and look at the society around us to see that even today, I mean, look at the US's arguments over drafting, well, putting women in selective service. I'll make, it's not a draft. It's the list you'd use if you initiated the draft. But and how resistant both sides of the aisle were to a large degree to women being included in that list. I mean, it's not a draft. It's not like they have any. Being included in that list won't cause women to have to go into the military at this point. It's just a list, and it still caused an enormous argument over decades.
Yeah, and back to the origins of gynocentrism and such. I think the seeds were sown much farther down, but it really coalesced and bloomed, I suppose, closer to where Peter Wright has it. I think.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Maybe some examples could be found elsewhere that kind of vary in time as well, but that's worth looking into. But the one thing that I'm very hesitant about the innate hypothesis is that the implications are kind of bad, because I don't believe that men are destined to sacrifice themselves for women biologically. I don't believe that. So.
As I said, I suspect there may be a small component of that, but I think it's overwhelmingly, predominantly cultural. So my view is, I've said my aim is we should eliminate gynocentrism to the extent that we can, is the way that I've put it. So basically, we should attempt to minimize it. If we can't completely eliminate it, we should at least try to minimize it.
I want to leave with a bit of what I hope is an optimistic note that like if even if there is some gynocentrism that still kind of lingers on, I think we could still hack away a ton of it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's overwhelmingly cultural.
Yeah, and I really do think it's possible. Like, I'm very confident about that, but people need to kind of apply themselves, I suppose.
Do you know something? I think we've started. I actually think we've started in these last few years, in all honesty. With some of the things that have happened with Johnny Depp's trial, with the defamation trial, for example, people are seeing things and talking about things that they wouldn't have even looked at a few years ago. In terms of,
I'm still surprised at the verdict, though. Like, I'm glad, but I'm still kind of in bemusement that so many people actually do take Depp's side, and he deserves the support, and I'm glad he's gotten the verdict he got and everything. But like, this seems like a fantasy. Like how is this possible in this gynocentric society?
A lot of people were very pessimistic about it. A lot of people we know were very pessimistic about it. Yeah, it did probably come as something of a surprise, but I think it is to a certain extent. I think it's a sign of change. Even talking about these issues, the fact he's famous, obviously, has caused people to look at it when they wouldn't have otherwise looked at it. We know there are so many cases like this occurring that nobody cared about, but because he was already well regarded, it caused them to look to sit up and take notice. And
well, this is even after the smear campaign. Everybody. It just seemed to me like everybody was already against him.
Yeah.
So.
No, it's interesting. So I think we are seeing. I think we're actually turning a corner in the last even the last 2-3 years, I just a sense of change in
Yeah,
society, in Western
but
society.
we must not rest on our laurels, so to speak. I think there's more work to be done. Like this isn't like the
We
this.
will redouble our efforts.
Yeah. Let's keep going.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. Keep the pressure up. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
And we've got, I mean, of course, we've got a voice for men. We've got Wiki for Men. There's lots of great information on there, and more will be added. And I think we can. The information is being disseminated through society. So I think we're starting to move in the right direction. I'm actually not naturally an optimist, but I sense a change in the last few years.
That's good. I mean, I try to keep a positive outlook, but it's hard for me to be likewise optimistic as well. Given like the facts of the state of affairs and everything like that. But I try to live as if there's hope.
And what next time? I think we didn't really get to talk much about misandry this time. Why don't we talk about misandry next time and some of the problems that men talk about, some of the problems that men see, and I think some people will be quite shocked at some of the things that have happened historically.
Yep.
And what I said, I mean, in the last few decades and so forth, some of the things that have occurred. But that would be a great topic for next time.
I think we'll do that. I'll make a mental note of it. So
yeah. So great to talk to you, Vernon. And
absolutely.
Chat again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, sure. I hope you guys enjoyed it.
See ya. Bye.